She left before sunrise, and she took nothing except the names of people no one remembered. Alpha King Alexander Hayes stood inside Emily Carter's empty room, staring at the narrow wooden desk beneath the frost-covered window. The first light of morning touched the palace walls, but there was no warmth in the room. Emily was gone. Her bed was neatly made. Her gray winter coat was missing, along with the worn boots she usually kept beside the door. Everything else remained exactly where she had left it, as if she had simply stepped outside for a moment and intended to return. But Alexander knew better. Emily Carter did not leave without a reason. He walked toward the desk and noticed a single sheet of paper resting beneath a small silver candle holder. He picked it up. Names covered the page. Mrs. Bennet. Thomas Reed. The Miller family. Pine Hollow. Several elderly residents. A few families from settlements almost 170 miles north of the capital. Beside each name were only a few words. Medicine. Food. Firewood. Blankets. Alexander read the list again. These were not noble families. They were not council members. They were ordinary people living beyond the roads most members of the royal court ever traveled. Why had an Omega with almost no influence been keeping track of them? Daniel Brooks, the royal steward, appeared quietly at the doorway. Your Majesty, the guards found no sign that Emily was forced to leave. Alexander looked up. I did not think she was. Daniel stepped closer. She left on her own. Alexander's eyes returned to the paper. That answer should have made things easier. It did not. Emily had always been quiet. She rarely spoke during court gatherings, never demanded attention, and often stepped aside when others entered a room. To most of the palace, she was simply the rejected Omega who had learned to stay invisible. Alexander remembered seeing her carrying baskets through the palace corridors, visiting the infirmary, and speaking softly with servants. He had noticed her presence many times. He had never stopped to ask what she was doing. Now every memory seemed different. Daniel pointed toward the paper. There is something beneath it. Alexander lifted the sheet and found a small envelope. Inside was a short handwritten note. Please make sure they are not forgotten. He read the sentence twice. Who are they? Daniel asked. Alexander looked at the names. The people on this list. Then he noticed something strange. At the bottom of the page was one final name. His own. Alexander Hayes. There were no notes beside it. No request. No explanation. Just his name. He stared at it for several seconds. Why would she write mine? Daniel had no answer. Alexander folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his coat. Find everyone on this list. Daniel nodded. All of them. Every name. Daniel left the room, and Alexander remained beside the empty desk. Outside, snow drifted across the palace courtyard, covering the roads Emily might have taken. He looked once more at the empty room. The court believed the rejected Omega had simply disappeared because she wanted to escape. Alexander was beginning to suspect something else. Emily had not left because she wanted to be forgotten. She had left because someone else needed to be remembered. And somewhere beyond the northern road, the first clue to what she had sacrificed was already waiting. By noon, Alexander had every name from Emily's list spread across the council table. The palace records were orderly, precise, and strangely empty of answers. Mrs. Bennet was listed as a widow living nearly 170 miles north of the capital. Thomas Reed was a farmer from a settlement called Pine Hollow. The Miller family had requested winter supplies twice. Several elderly residents appeared in old records but had received no recent assistance. Alexander looked from one file to another. What do these people have in common? Daniel Brooks studied the papers. They are all from the northern settlements. Alexander shook his head. That is not enough. Daniel turned another page. There is something else. He placed a collection of small receipts on the table. Medicine. Bread. Firewood. Blankets. Every purchase had been made in modest amounts, usually only a few dollars at a time. None carried the royal seal. All had been paid for by Emily Carter. Alexander stared at the receipts. How much? Daniel calculated carefully. Almost her entire personal allowance over several months. Alexander leaned back slowly. Emily had never possessed much. As a rejected Omega, she had lived quietly within the palace, receiving little attention and even less influence. Yet she had been spending what little she had on people hundreds of miles away. Why did she not ask the palace for assistance? Alexander asked. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Perhaps she did not believe anyone would listen. The answer stayed in the room. Alexander remembered the countless times Emily had stood silently near the edge of a gathering. He had seen people speak over her. He had seen her step aside. He had never considered what those moments might have taught her. Daniel opened another folder. There is more. Inside were royal shipment reports from the northern settlements. The records showed that food, medicine, and winter supplies had been delivered regularly. But the local requests told a different story. Several families had reported shortages. Pine Hollow had requested medicine 3 times. Another settlement had requested firewood twice. Yet the royal records marked those deliveries as completed. Alexander's expression hardened with concern. Who signed these? Daniel pointed to the bottom of each page. Different names appeared, but the same administrative office had approved them. The Northern Supply Office, Daniel said. Alexander picked up the oldest report. When did Emily begin helping these families? Daniel checked the dates. About 3 months ago. Alexander looked at the first missing shipment. The date was nearly identical. A quiet connection formed in his mind. Emily had not simply wandered north because she wanted to help strangers. She had noticed something the palace had failed to notice. Someone had marked supplies as delivered when the families were still waiting. Where is Pine Hollow? Alexander asked. Daniel unfolded a regional map. About 170 miles north. There is a farmhouse belonging to Mrs. Bennet along the route. Alexander remembered her name from the list. Then we start there. Daniel hesitated. Your Majesty, should we send an official team? Alexander folded the reports. No, he looked toward the window, where snow was beginning to fall again. If Emily left because she did not want the palace following her, sending a procession will only make her disappear farther. Daniel nodded. Alexander took Emily's list and placed it inside his coat. As he walked toward the palace doors, he stopped for one final look at the page. His own name remained at the bottom. No explanation. No message. Just Alexander Hayes. He could not stop wondering why Emily had written it there. Perhaps she wanted him to know what she had discovered. Perhaps she wanted him to understand why she had left. Or perhaps the answer was much simpler. Perhaps she had written his name because, somewhere in her quiet heart, she had hoped that this time, the Alpha King would finally notice. Alexander stepped into the winter air. The northern road waited beyond the palace gates, and with every mile ahead, the mystery of Emily's disappearance was becoming something much larger than a missing Omega. It was becoming a question the entire kingdom might soon have to answer. The lantern at Pine Hollow was still burning when Alexander stepped from the carriage. Snow covered the road behind him, but the small settlement ahead showed signs of life. Warm light glowed through cottage windows, thin smoke curled from chimneys, and fresh footprints crossed the snow toward the old ranger station. Alexander followed them without speaking. Daniel Brooks stayed close, carrying the northern records they had collected along the journey. The footprints were smaller than his own. They belonged to one person. Emily. When they reached the ranger station, Alexander stopped several feet from the door. Through the frosted glass, he could see her moving quietly beside a wooden table. She was speaking to an elderly man, then handing a bowl of warm food to a young girl. Her long light brown hair was loosely tied behind her shoulders, and her gray winter dress looked thinner than it should have for such a cold night. She did not look like someone who had escaped. She looked like someone who had stayed behind for others. Alexander raised his hand toward the door, then paused. He wanted to understand before he interrupted. Emily opened a small canvas bag and counted several medicine bottles. Her expression changed. There were not many left. She placed one beside the elderly man's chair and another near the child's blanket. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a single silver coin. She stared at it for a moment. It was probably the last money she had. The elderly man noticed. "Keep that for yourself, Emily." She smiled gently. "I will be fine. You have already given too much." Emily shook her head. "Someone else needs it more." Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. He had expected to find an Omega hiding from the palace. Instead, he had found a woman quietly spending the last of what she owned on people she barely knew. Daniel leaned closer. "Your Majesty, the records." Alexander looked down at the documents in his hand. The last shipment to Pine Hollow had been marked complete nearly 3 months earlier. Yet the shelves inside the ranger station were almost empty. Emily had been filling a gap the royal system had failed to notice. But how had she known? Alexander looked through the window again. Emily was now sorting handwritten notes, comparing names and dates. She was not guessing. She was investigating. He suddenly understood why his own name had appeared at the bottom of her list. She had been trying to lead him toward the truth without ever asking him to follow. Alexander opened the door. Emily turned immediately. Her eyes widened when she saw him standing there. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she looked at the papers in his hand. "You came." Alexander stepped inside, snow melting from his coat. "You knew I would." Emily lowered her gaze. "I hoped you would understand." He looked around the small station, at the empty shelves, the medicine bottles, and the families she had been helping. "Emily, what happened here?" She took a slow breath. "The shipment stopped arriving." Alexander already knew that part. What he did not know was why she had chosen to carry the burden alone. Emily looked toward the snowy window. "I thought if I stayed quiet, I could help them without making things worse." Alexander studied her face. "And what did it cost you?" Emily did not answer. She simply looked down at the silver coin she had just given away. That was when Alexander finally understood. The greatest part of her sacrifice was not what she had done for the northern settlements. It was what she had never told anyone she had given up for them. The silence between them lasted longer than Emily expected. Alexander looked at the silver coin on the table, then at the nearly empty medicine bag beside it. "You gave away everything you had," he said quietly. Emily shook her head. "Not everything. Emily." His voice was gentle, but she could hear the concern beneath it. "You barely have enough to stay warm." She glanced toward the window. "The families here needed more." Alexander looked around the ranger station. There were only a few blankets, several jars of preserved food, and a small stack of handwritten records. Nothing about the place suggested that an Omega had been living there for months. It looked temporary, as though Emily had never intended to stay long enough to call it home. Daniel placed the supply reports on the table. "These shipments were marked as delivered," he said. "But the villagers say they never arrived." Emily nodded. "That is why I came here." She pulled another folder from beneath the table. "At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I noticed the same thing happening in several settlements." Alexander opened the folder. Inside were copies of delivery notices, village requests, and dates written in Emily's careful handwriting. "You collected all of this yourself?" he asked. "Yes." "Why did you not send it to me?" Emily hesitated. "I did." Alexander looked up. "Twice." Her voice became softer. "The first message received no answer. The second one came back unopened." Daniel exchanged a glance with Alexander. That detail changed everything. Emily had tried to reach the palace. She had not simply chosen to disappear. She had been ignored before she ever left. Alexander studied the records again. Who handled the northern reports? Daniel checked the documents. The regional supply office. Who approved them? Daniel pointed to several signatures. Different clerks, but the same office. Emily looked toward the floor. "I did not know what else to do." Alexander's expression softened. "So you came here. People were waiting. And you thought you could solve the entire problem yourself?" Emily gave a small smile. "I thought I could help one family at a time." Alexander looked at her for a long moment. That answer told him more than any report could. She had never imagined herself as a hero. She had simply refused to walk past people who needed help. Daniel began sorting the documents into separate groups. "There are enough records here to begin a formal investigation." Alexander nodded. "Then we will." Emily looked surprised. "You believe me?" Alexander met her eyes. "I believe the evidence." Then he paused. "And I believe you." Emily looked away quickly, as though those 4 words were harder to accept than any accusation could have been. Alexander noticed how tired she looked. "When did you last eat?" Emily hesitated. "This morning." Daniel quietly opened a basket he had brought from the carriage and placed bread, soup, fruit, and warm tea on the table. Emily stared at it. "You brought food?" "For everyone," Daniel said. Alexander pulled out a chair. "Sit." Emily did, slowly. For the first time since she had left the palace, someone was taking care of her without asking her to earn it first. She held the warm cup between her hands. Alexander watched her quietly. He had come north searching for an explanation. Instead, he had found a truth that was much harder to face. Emily had not disappeared because she wanted to escape her place in the kingdom. She had disappeared because she had stopped believing anyone would notice when she needed help. And now Alexander understood that finding her was only the beginning. He had to find the reason she had lost faith in being seen. The next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving Pine Hollow beneath a clear blue sky. Alexander stood beside the ranger station window while Daniel prepared the documents for the investigation. Emily sat at the wooden table, quietly reviewing the names of families who still needed assistance. She looked different from the woman Alexander had found the night before. Not stronger because someone had rescued her, but lighter because she no longer had to carry the secret alone. "How long have you been doing this?" Alexander asked. Emily looked at the list. "Since early winter." "And how many settlements?" 5 that I know of." Alexander exchanged a glance with Daniel. 5 settlements meant hundreds of people. He looked back at Emily. "You traveled between them by yourself?" Emily nodded. "Mostly on foot or with local farmers when they had room in their wagons." Alexander frowned with concern. "Some of those roads are nearly 20 miles apart." "I know." She smiled faintly. "That is why I left early." Daniel placed a map on the table. "There is another problem. The supply records show that several shipments were redirected before reaching these settlements." Emily pointed to a marked route. "I noticed that." "How?" "The families told me what they were missing. Then I compared their reports with the notices posted at the local office." Alexander followed her finger across the map. You found the pattern. I found enough to know something was wrong. She opened another folder. Inside were copies of receipts and handwritten statements from villagers. I wanted to send everything to the palace, but after my second message came back unopened, I thought no one would believe me. Alexander was silent. That sentence hurt more than he expected. Not because she had accused him directly, but because she had not even expected him to care. Emily, he said quietly, you should have been able to ask for help. She looked at him. I did. The words were simple. Alexander lowered his gaze. There was nothing he could say to change what had already happened. So he did something different. He picked up the northern records and placed them beside her notes. Then we will make sure your next request is heard. Daniel nodded. I can arrange direct communication between each settlement and the royal office. Emily looked surprised. You would do that? Alexander answered, yes. She looked down at the documents. What about the missing supplies? We will investigate them. And the families? They will receive what they need. Emily's shoulders relaxed. For months, she had carried the fear that if she stopped moving, someone would go without help. Now the responsibility was finally becoming larger than one person. Alexander looked at the nearly empty canvas bag beside her. You cannot keep giving away everything you have. Emily smiled gently. I know. Do you? I am learning. That answer made Alexander smile for the first time that morning. Later, royal wagons arrived in Pine Hollow carrying food, medicine, blankets, and firewood. The villagers gathered quietly as the supplies were unloaded. Emily stood near the doorway, watching families receive what they had been waiting for. She did not step forward to accept their thanks. She simply smiled. Alexander watched her from a short distance away. He had come north believing he was searching for a missing Omega. Now he understood that Emily had been searching for something too. She had been searching for proof that someone in the kingdom would finally notice the people everyone else had forgotten. And as the first supplies reached the families, Alexander realized he had one more responsibility. He had to make sure Emily never again believed that disappearing was the only way she could make a difference. By late afternoon, the northern road was quiet again, but Emily could not stop thinking about the conversation she had shared with Alexander. For months, she had believed that asking for help would only prove what everyone already assumed about her. Now the royal wagons were standing outside the ranger station, families were receiving supplies, and Daniel was already organizing a direct communication system between Pine Hollow and the palace. The change felt almost too quick to believe. Alexander found Emily near the edge of the settlement, watching the final wagon disappear down the snowy road. You are thinking too much, he said. She turned with a faint smile. I do that often. He stood beside her, leaving a comfortable distance between them. You should not have had to solve all of this alone. Emily looked toward the village. I did not know anyone else would come. Alexander was quiet for a moment. That is the part one cannot forget. She looked at him. What part? That you expected no one to come. His words were gentle, but they reached deeper than she expected. Emily lowered her eyes. It was easier that way. Easier? If I expected nothing, I could not be disappointed. Alexander understood then that the problem was larger than missing shipments. Emily had spent so long being overlooked that she had learned to make herself independent of everyone else's attention. He wanted to tell her that she never should have had to learn that lesson. Instead, he said, you do not have to live that way anymore. Emily looked at him carefully. You cannot promise that everyone will care. No, Alexander replied. But I can promise that I will listen. She was silent. The wind moved gently through the pine trees. Then Emily asked, why? Alexander considered the question. He could have answered as her king, saying that every member of the kingdom deserved protection. But that was not the whole truth. Because I should have listened before. Emily looked surprised. You did not know. That is not an excuse. She studied him for several seconds, then smiled softly. You are different from the man I remember. Alexander gave a quiet laugh. I hope that is a good thing. I think it is. Daniel approached from the ranger station carrying a sealed folder. Your Majesty, the initial review is complete. The Northern Office records do not match the settlement records. We have enough evidence to begin a formal investigation. Alexander accepted the folder. Good. Begin immediately. Daniel nodded and returned to his work. Emily watched him leave. What happens now? She asked. Alexander looked toward the road leading south. The supplies continue. The investigation continues. And you return to the palace with me. Emily hesitated. Why? Because you have done enough for everyone else. He looked directly at her. Now I want you to think about what you need. Emily felt a strange warmth behind her eyes. No one had ever asked her that question without expecting an answer that benefited someone else. I do not know, she admitted. Alexander smiled gently. Then take your time. They began walking toward the carriage together. Emily looked back once at Pine Hollow. The settlement no longer felt like a place she had to save alone. It felt like a place she could continue serving without carrying the entire burden herself. As the carriage turned toward the south, Emily watched the snowy road disappear behind them. She had left the palace believing she needed to vanish to matter. Now she was returning because someone had finally shown her that being seen did not mean losing herself. But Emily did not yet know that when they reached the capital, Alexander intended to tell the entire council what she had done. And this time, he would make sure no one could look away. The palace gates opened just before sunset, and Emily felt the familiar weight of old memories settle over her. She had once walked through those gates believing she had no place beyond them. Now she returned beside the Alpha King, carrying records that could change how the entire kingdom treated its northern settlements. The great hall was already filled when they entered. Council members stood around the long oak table, speaking quietly as Alexander and Emily approached. Daniel Brooks placed the northern reports before them. Emily noticed several familiar faces among the council. Some had once looked through her as though she were invisible. She lowered her eyes for a moment, but Alexander noticed. Stay beside me, he said quietly. Emily looked at him. Why? Because this truth belongs to you too. The council became silent when Alexander took his place at the center of the room. He did not begin with accusations. He began with facts. For 3 months, official records have shown that supplies reached the northern settlements. They did not. Daniel opened the first report. He explained the missing deliveries, the repeated requests, and the records Emily had collected herself. Then Alexander placed her handwritten notes beside the official documents. While this council believed the system was working, he said, Emily Carter was traveling nearly 170 miles from the capital to help families who had been overlooked. A murmur moved through the chamber. Emily felt uncomfortable hearing her own actions described aloud. She had never considered them important enough to discuss. One council member looked toward her. She acted without royal authorization. Alexander turned calmly. She acted because the authorized system had failed. The room fell silent. Emily looked at Alexander, surprised by the certainty in his voice. He continued. She used her own money to buy medicine. She shared food. She found blankets and firewood. She visited families who had stopped expecting help from the palace. Another official spoke carefully. But she is an Omega without administrative training. Alexander looked at him. And yet she found a problem this council did not. No one answered. Daniel placed another document on the table. These are the requests Emily sent to the palace before she traveled north. Both were returned without action. Emily lowered her gaze. She had not wanted anyone to know about those letters. Alexander saw her expression and softened his voice. You should not have had to prove your worth by suffering quietly. The words reached her more deeply than she expected. For years, she had believed that being useful was the closest she could come to being valued. Now the entire council was hearing what she had done, and for the first time, she did not feel ashamed of being seen. Alexander turned toward the council. The Northern Supply System will be placed under direct royal review. Every missing shipment will be investigated. Communication between the settlements and the palace will be restored. Then he looked at Emily. And Emily Carter will serve as royal advisor for the northern communities. Emily's eyes widened. Me? Alexander nodded. Only if you choose it. The council waited. Emily looked around the room. She could have remembered every insult, every dismissal, every moment when she had been made to feel small. Instead, she remembered Pine Hollow, the families, and the warm light inside the ranger station. She took a slow breath. I choose it. Alexander smiled. The room remained quiet, but something had changed. The rejected Omega who had once disappeared without a word was now standing in the center of the Royal Council, not asking to be accepted, but choosing where she belonged. Yet when the meeting ended, Alexander still had one more conversation to have with her, and this one would not be about duty, sacrifice, or the northern settlements. It would be about Emily herself. The palace garden was almost empty when Emily stepped beneath the old oak tree. Snow rested quietly along the branches, and warm light from the palace windows stretched across the white paths. Alexander was waiting there, without the council members, without the royal attendants, and without the formal expression he had worn in the great hall. Emily stopped a few feet away. You wanted to speak with me? Alexander nodded. I did. For a moment, neither said anything. Emily expected another discussion about the northern settlements, another report, another responsibility. Instead, Alexander looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. You accepted the position today. I did. Why? Emily smiled faintly. Because the families still need someone who understands what happened. Alexander nodded. That is one reason. Emily studied him. What is the other? He looked toward the palace. Because you finally chose something for yourself. The words made her pause. She had spent so long thinking about what other people needed that the idea of choosing for herself still felt unfamiliar. Alexander continued carefully. I want you to understand something, Emily. You do not owe this kingdom another sacrifice. She looked down. I know. Do you? His voice remained gentle. You gave away your money. You left the palace alone. You traveled through winter roads. You carried responsibilities that belonged to an entire system. Emily took a slow breath. I could not leave people without help. I know. Alexander stepped closer, but stopped before entering her space. That kindness is part of who you are. I would never ask you to change it. Emily looked into his gray eyes. Then what do you want? Alexander was silent for several seconds. When he finally answered, his voice was quieter. I want you to stay. Her expression changed. As the royal advisor? If that is what you want. He paused. But not only for that. Emily's heart began to beat faster. Alexander continued before she could misunderstand. I have spent years believing that being king meant making every decision alone. I thought protecting people meant deciding what was best for them. You showed me that real protection also means listening. Emily looked toward the snowy path. I did not mean to teach you anything. You did anyway. A small smile appeared between them. Emily looked back at him. And if I leave? Alexander answered without hesitation. Then I will respect your decision. The position will remain open, and the northern settlements will still receive support. Emily studied his face, searching for the pressure she had known from others. There was none. He was truly giving her a choice. You would let me go. I would never keep you by obligation. Her eyes softened. Why are you making this so difficult? Alexander smiled. Because I want you to choose freely. Emily looked toward the palace, then toward the road beyond the garden. She remembered the woman who had left with one worn coat, a nearly empty bag, and a list of forgotten names. That woman had believed disappearing was the safest way to matter. She had been wrong. She had never needed to erase herself to deserve a place in the world. Emily turned back to Alexander. I am not ready to promise what the future will be. He nodded. Neither am I. She smiled. But I am willing to stay and find out. Alexander offered his hand. Emily looked at it, then placed her hand in his. There was no ceremony, no command, and no audience. Only a choice freely made beneath the winter moon. For the first time, Emily did not feel like an omega waiting to be accepted. She felt like a woman deciding where her life would go. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, the northern lights began to glow across the winter sky, as if the kingdom itself were quietly witnessing the beginning of something neither of them had planned. 3 weeks later, the northern settlements no longer waited in silence for supplies that might never arrive. New royal wagons traveled the roads each week, carrying food, medicine, blankets, and firewood to the families Emily had once helped alone. At Pine Hollow, the small ranger station had become a direct communication point between the northern communities and the palace. Emily stood outside one quiet morning, watching the first wagon arrive. She smiled as villagers gathered, not with desperation this time, but with relief. The system was finally working. Daniel Brooks had helped establish the new records office, while Emily reviewed requests from each settlement and made sure their concerns reached the council. She still worked hard, but something inside her had changed. She no longer believed every problem belonged on her shoulders. When she returned to the palace that evening, she found Alexander waiting beneath the old oak tree in the garden. Snow covered the branches, and warm light spilled from the palace windows behind him. You look tired, he said. Emily smiled. You always notice that now. I am learning. She stood beside him and looked toward the glowing windows. Pine Hollow received everything today. I know. The Miller family received medicine. Mrs. Bennet received firewood. Thomas Reed said his children finally have enough food for the winter. Alexander smiled. Then your work is making a difference. Emily shook her head gently. Our work. He looked at her. That sounds better. For a moment, they simply stood together. Emily remembered the first night she had left the palace, carrying a nearly empty bag and believing that disappearing was the only way to help anyone. She remembered how certain she had been that nobody would notice her absence. Now she understood how wrong she had been. Not because everyone had suddenly changed, but because she had finally stopped measuring her worth by how much she could endure alone. Alexander looked toward her. Do you ever regret leaving? Emily thought about the question. I regret believing I had to disappear. He nodded slowly. I regret not noticing sooner. Emily looked at him. You cannot change the past. No, he said. But I can change what comes next. She smiled. There was no grand declaration, no royal ceremony, and no promise that their future would be perfect. There was only trust built. One choice at a time. Alexander offered his hand, and Emily accepted it. She did not feel smaller beside him. She did not feel like an omega standing beneath the shadow of a king. She felt like herself. The woman who had once been overlooked was now helping shape the future of the northern communities. The king who had once believed strength meant carrying every decision alone had learned that listening could be a greater form of leadership. Together, They walked toward the palace doors as the first snow of the evening began to fall. Emily paused once and looked back at the garden. Her old footprints had disappeared beneath the fresh snow, but she no longer needed to follow them backward. She was walking forward now. Her sacrifice had helped others survive a difficult winter, but it had also taught the kingdom something it had forgotten: kindness does not become less powerful because it is quiet. Strength does not always arrive with a crown. And love does not begin when someone finally decides you are worthy. Sometimes, love begins when two people look at each other honestly and choose to walk forward together. Emily had spent years believing she needed to disappear to matter. Now, beneath the warm lights of the palace, she understood the truth. She had never been invisible. She had simply been waiting for someone willing to truly see her.